You think you can escape me? I whispered to myself as I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles whitening under the rain-soaked leather. The streets of Manhattan were slick with the evening storm, neon lights reflecting off puddles like fractured mirrors, and every heartbeat thudded in my chest louder than the raindrops hammering my windshield. My old Toyota squeaked as I turned onto a narrower street, hoping to lose sight of the dark silhouette in the black SUV following me, but I caught a glimpse of him through the rearview mirror. Victor Harrington, the man whose name alone could stop traffic, whose presence made the air itself feel charged. His eyes, cold and calculating beneath the sharp crease of his brow, locked on mine, unyielding and unblinking, and for a moment, I imagined freezing there, letting him decide my fate in the rain. The tires of my car slipped on the wet asphalt as I tried to think, tried to plan, but logic was drowned in the rhythm of my racing pulse. Every instinct screamed at me to stop or to escape, yet somewhere deep inside, I felt the gravity of his power pressing down, a magnetic pull I could not resist. The SUV drew closer, a steel predator moving with precision, and my stomach twisted as I realized there was nowhere left to run. Then, a momentary break in traffic, a chance, and I turned hard, the Toyota fishtailing slightly, lights of the city streaking past, and there he was, emerging from the shadows, taller than I remembered, dark hair slicked back, the tailored suit clinging perfectly to his broad shoulders, his presence impossible to ignore. "Emily," his voice carried over the roar of rain and city noise, low and measured, yet it made my knees weak, "you belong to me." The words were simple, undeniable, but they carried the weight of a lifetime of control, of deals and debts, of streets ruled by his command. I swallowed hard, the taste of metal from a bitten lip mixing with the storm in my mouth, and I felt the world narrow to the space between us, to the electric pull of inevitability. My mind raced, grasping for defiance, for a reason, any reason why this could not be real, yet his gaze held me in place, a law of gravity stronger than fear. Every raindrop seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat, every car horn a distant drum marking my surrender, and when he stepped closer, the air itself seemed to bend around his authority. I wanted to run, to scream, to dissolve into the shadows of the city, but I remained, rooted by a mix of awe and terror, and even as the storm soaked through my clothes, even as my hands shook and my breath came in quick, uneven gasps, a strange clarity settled over me. This was the night nothing would ever be the same. The night one man's presence, one claim of ownership, shifted everything I thought I knew about safety, about choice, about the fragile illusion of control. Victor Harrington's hand extended, not touching yet commanding, and I realized with a shiver that the rules had changed, that from this moment forward, my life was entwined with his, and the storm, the rain, the city itself seemed to conspire with the inevitability of his words, "You're mine, Emily, and tonight changes everything." The rain had slowed to a drizzle by the time we arrived at his estate, the towering gates looming over me like silent sentinels as I followed Victor through the winding driveway, my shoes slipping slightly on the wet pavement. Every step toward the grand mansion heightened my awareness of the distance between my ordinary life and the world he inhabited, a place of immaculately trimmed hedges, gleaming marble columns, and the faint scent of expensive leather mixed with rain-dampened stone. Inside, the foyer was a cathedral of luxury, crystal chandeliers reflecting shards of light across the polished floors, and the sound of our footsteps echoed in the vast space, making me feel both exposed and insignificant. Victor moved with the quiet authority of someone who did not need to raise his voice to command attention, each step deliberate, measured, and unyielding, and I could not help but notice the precision in the way his suit fell over his broad shoulders, the way his eyes scanned the room as if every detail belonged to him. My pulse raced, not from fear alone, but from the overwhelming realization that I was now completely within his world, a world with rules I had not been taught, a world where he was the law. He paused near the grand staircase and glanced back at me, his piercing blue eyes locking onto mine, the unspoken assertion of his control filling the space between us like tangible electricity. I felt the weight of his gaze, a subtle but relentless pressure that seemed to follow my every thought, and I knew that any hesitation, any attempt to assert my own will, would be immediately noticed. As he led me through the corridors, I caught glimpses of the rooms, each meticulously arranged, from the library with floor-to-ceiling books that smelled of old paper and polished wood, to the study where dark leather chairs and heavy mahogany furniture spoke of meetings and decisions made behind closed doors. I tried to keep my breathing steady, though my chest felt tight, my stomach a knot of tension and anticipation, each new turn revealing another layer of the life I had been thrust into. Victor stopped in a smaller sitting room, where the rain pattered softly against the tall windows, and gestured for me to sit. I obeyed instinctively, my hands fidgeting on my lap, while he stood near the window, observing the storm outside, the profile of power and control etched into every line of his posture. The room was silent except for the soft hiss of the rain, and in that quiet, I felt the stark contrast between my uncertainty and his composed dominance, an invisible boundary drawn that separated fear from fascination. He finally spoke, his voice calm yet commanding, each word deliberate. "Emily, tonight changes everything, not just because of what has happened, but because of what will happen. You are here, and you are part of this world now. Understand that you cannot simply step away." His words settled over me like the last droplets of a storm, heavy, inevitable, and inescapable, and despite the unease twisting my gut, I could not deny the strange sense of order they brought. The moment stretched, his eyes meeting mine with unwavering intent, and I realized that the true power he wielded was not in force or threat, but in the quiet certainty of his presence, a gravity that pulled me in and refused to let go. I shifted slightly, my gaze lowering, aware of how small I felt against the expanse of the room, and yet I knew that the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm that had begun within me, the awareness that my life had irrevocably intertwined with his, that every choice I had thought I controlled had already been reshaped by this night, and that the path ahead would demand navigation through a world of expectation, authority, and undeniable connection to a man who commanded not just spaces, but hearts. And even in the hush of the rainy night, I sensed the quiet, relentless assertion of ownership that defined everything about him. Victor led me through the hallways with a quiet command, the soft click of his shoes on the marble floors marking each step like a metronome of authority, and I could not help but notice the way the mansion seemed to respond to his presence, the lights glinting off polished surfaces, shadows folding neatly into corners as if the building itself acknowledged his dominion. Every room we passed revealed glimpses of a life meticulously curated, a world where every object, every arrangement, was deliberate, controlled, and undeniably his. I followed, my hands brushing against the smooth walls, the coolness of the marble reminding me that I was in unfamiliar territory, my senses heightened with both anticipation and unease. When he stopped in the study, I took in the room fully, bookshelves lining the walls, filled with volumes that smelled of leather and old paper, a grand desk at the center, and sunlight filtering through tall windows, creating patterns on the floor that seemed to dance with the shifting dust particles in the air. Victor moved toward the desk, his posture unwavering, and gestured for me to remain standing while he reviewed papers with the quiet precision of someone accustomed to absolute control. I felt the weight of observation, the subtle tension in the room, knowing that every slight movement of mine was registered, measured, noted, yet without any overt pressure, just the unmistakable presence of his authority. My mind raced, imagining the countless decisions, the negotiations, the lives shaped within these walls. And I realized that being here was more than physical, it was a lesson in understanding influence, in recognizing the gravity of a presence that commanded without needing to raise a voice. I shifted slightly, adjusting to the rhythm of the room, and as I did, Victor turned his gaze toward me, a brief yet piercing acknowledgement, and I caught in that glance a promise of expectation, a quiet insistence that I would learn the boundaries, the rules, the subtleties of his world. The rain outside had slowed to a mist, tapping softly against the windows, a gentle reminder of the storm that had brought me here, yet inside, the air was charged with a different energy, a tension that vibrated quietly between us, unspoken but potent. I tried to steady my breath, to make sense of the overwhelming weight of everything around me, yet I found myself drawn to his presence, aware that even the silence he maintained held lessons, insights, and a demand for awareness. He moved with deliberation, checking details, reviewing notes, adjusting arrangements as if the room itself required constant attention, and I realized that control was not just about dominance, but about precision, about understanding the environment so fully that nothing could surprise, nothing could escape notice. In that moment, I understood the enormity of the shift that had occurred, that the world I had known was now replaced with a space governed by meticulous structure, quiet expectation, and a force of presence that I could not ignore. Every heartbeat echoed in tandem with the soft patter of the rain outside, and I felt a strange clarity, a recognition that I had stepped into a life where observation, awareness, and response were the only ways to navigate safely, and in that silent exchange, the lesson began to unfold, subtle yet undeniable, binding me to the rhythm of a world that was now as much his as it was mine. The mansion was quiet now, the storm outside reduced to a gentle drizzle tapping against the high windows, and I found myself following Victor into a smaller, more intimate room, the light softer here, the shadows long and stretching across the walls like silent witnesses. The air carried the faint scent of polished wood and aged books, comforting in its familiarity yet charged with an undeniable tension. Victor gestured toward the seating area, his movements precise and unhurried, and I realized that every action he took seemed deliberate, measured, as if even the smallest gesture carried meaning. I sat cautiously, hands folded in my lap, aware of the weight of his gaze, the way he observed not just my posture but the subtle flickers of emotion that crossed my face. He moved to the window, glancing out at the rain-streaked gardens below, his silhouette framed by the soft afternoon light filtering through the tall panes, and I could not look away, drawn inexplicably to the quiet authority he radiated. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the heating system, and in that stillness, I felt the sharp contrast between my nervous energy and his composed control, a rhythm that demanded both attention and awareness. I shifted slightly, attempting to maintain a sense of normalcy, yet every detail around me seemed to amplify the reality that I was now part of his world, a world structured with precision and expectation. Victor turned slowly, his eyes meeting mine, and there was a subtle shift, a recognition of my unease coupled with the quiet assertion of his presence, as if to say that I was seen, assessed, and that my reactions mattered more than I understood. The rain continued its soft percussion against the windows, each drop marking time in a space that felt both expansive and confining, and I realized that the true gravity of this situation was not in overt commands but in the silent exchange of awareness, of unspoken rules and boundaries being established. I tried to breathe steadily, to anchor myself in the sensory details, the polished floor beneath my feet, the faint warmth of the fireplace just visible in the corner, the soft rustle of his suit as he moved, and I began to notice the subtle humanity beneath his commanding exterior, glimpses of care woven into the way he anticipated the room, the seating, even the trajectory of conversation. In the quiet, I understood that this was a world where observation was key, where subtlety ruled, and where every movement, every glance, every silence carried weight. Victor spoke finally, his voice measured, neither raised nor rushed, yet resonating with a calm authority that filled the room and seemed to settle the edges of my anxiety. "You will learn quickly, Emily, that awareness and response are as much a part of this life as the choices you think you have. Observe, understand, and act with intention." I nodded slightly, feeling the truth in his words settle around me, a reminder that in this world, power was not always shown in grand gestures, but in the quiet certainty of presence, in the careful orchestration of space and perception. And as the afternoon light shifted, casting long, soft shadows across the room, I recognized that I was being inducted into a rhythm, a pace, and a structure that would define every step I took from this moment forward, the storm outside now merely a backdrop to the storm of awareness and expectation that had begun within the walls of this mansion. The afternoon light shifted subtly, casting warm golden hues across the polished floors as Victor guided me into a room lined with large windows that looked out over the estate gardens, each step deliberate and unhurried, his presence filling the space with a quiet, inescapable authority. The sound of distant birds and the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind reached us faintly, a soft contrast to the intensity of the world I had been thrust into, and I felt a strange mix of tension and fascination as I followed his movements, noting the precision in the way he navigated the room, the careful attention to every detail from the placement of furniture to the subtle adjustment of curtains to catch the light just so. I seated myself near a small table, my hands clasped tightly, and could not stop observing the way he moved, each gesture carrying weight and intention, the faint scent of cologne mingling with the crisp air of the room, anchoring me to the moment. Victor turned toward me, his gaze steady and unyielding, and even in the quiet, I could sense the layers of expectation, the unspoken rules of conduct in a space so meticulously maintained, and I realized that my awareness, my reactions, my very posture, were now part of a dynamic he was orchestrating, testing not through command but through observation and subtle suggestion. The room seemed to breathe around us, the soft light highlighting the elegance of the setting, and yet beneath that elegance lay an undercurrent of influence and authority that pressed on me gently but relentlessly. I shifted slightly, adjusting to the rhythm of his presence, and noticed the subtle indications of his attentiveness, the way he registered the smallest detail in my expression, a raised eyebrow, a quick inhale, a fleeting glance, and I became acutely aware of how much power existed in quiet command, in the ability to guide without force, to dominate a space simply through presence. The gentle hum of the air conditioning filled the background as he approached the table, placing a single leather-bound book before me with a soft thud that seemed louder than any sound around us, and his eyes met mine once again, conveying focus, expectation, and an unspoken challenge that this was not merely a physical space but a place of learning, of adaptation, of understanding the subtle interplay of observation, choice, and response. I took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the evening pressing gently against my awareness, and recognized that being here was not about submission in the traditional sense, but about attuning to a rhythm that required mindfulness, respect for structure, and a growing comprehension of the authority that Victor embodied. As I opened the book, the soft pages crackling faintly, I felt the gravity of the moment settle, a realization that each decision, each motion, each reaction would now be guided not only by circumstance but by the unspoken expectations of a presence that had already reshaped the landscape of my life. And outside the windows, the fading light of day mirrored the slow but steady immersion into a world defined by precision, awareness, and the undeniable influence of a man who had claimed a subtle but unyielding hold over both the space and the trajectory of the life unfolding within it. Evening settled over the estate, the sky a gradient of deep blues and purples, and I followed Victor into the conservatory, where the soft glow of hanging lanterns illuminated exotic plants and the faint fragrance of blooming orchids filled the air. The space felt alive yet controlled, each leaf and vine positioned as if under silent instruction, and I realized that his influence extended beyond people to the very environment, shaping every detail with subtle precision. Victor moved toward a set of French doors opening onto a balcony, his steps measured, deliberate, and I trailed close enough to feel the energy of his presence without overstepping, my heart quickening at the rhythm of his movement. The air outside was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and garden blossoms, a contrast to the warmth of the room behind us, and I paused at the threshold, absorbing the view of the manicured grounds stretching into the distance, lit by soft lanterns and the fading glow of sunset. He did not speak immediately, but I felt the weight of his attention, the way his eyes registered every nuance of my expression, the slight tremor of my hands, the hesitant tilt of my head, as though observing a delicate instrument responding to touch. I shifted slightly, attempting to steady my breathing, and he finally turned, the faintest curve at the edge of his lips acknowledging my presence without breaking the composed dominance that seemed to emanate from him effortlessly. "Emily," he said softly, the voice calm yet carrying a subtle insistence that demanded focus, "you are learning the rhythm, the flow of observation and response. In this space, every action matters, every hesitation is noted, and every choice shapes the path ahead. Watch, listen, adapt." I nodded, feeling the gravity of his words settle over me, a mixture of reassurance and challenge that made my pulse quicken and yet provided clarity within the tension. We lingered on the balcony, the night air cool against my skin, and I noticed the way the lanterns reflected in his eyes, a soft illumination that highlighted the intensity of his gaze, and I understood that presence, quiet authority, and deliberate attention were more powerful than any command or gesture. The gentle rustle of leaves, the distant call of a night bird, the subtle shift of air currents across the balcony all seemed amplified in this moment, and I felt as though the world had narrowed to the span between us, a space charged with observation, awareness, and expectation. Victor gestured to the view, and I followed his line of sight, noting the symmetry of the gardens, the meticulous arrangement of paths and fountains, the interplay of light and shadow, and recognized the parallel to the structured world he was guiding me into, where subtlety and mindfulness were as vital as action. I breathed in slowly, grounding myself in the sensory details, the smooth railing under my palms, the faint scent of orchids mingling with evening air, the soft hum of distant wildlife, and realized that each moment, each observation, was a step in understanding, a step in learning the silent language of influence and presence that Victor wielded so naturally, and that the evening, with its shifting light and careful stillness, was becoming a quiet lesson in adaptation, perception, and the subtle but undeniable power of attentive awareness. The evening had deepened into a calm, star-strewn night, and I followed Victor through the winding corridors of the mansion, my footsteps quiet against the polished marble as the dim lighting cast long, soft shadows across the walls. Each room we passed felt like a stage set meticulously for his presence, the subtle alignment of furniture, the arrangement of art, and the gentle hum of the heating system all conspiring to reinforce the rhythm of control he maintained over the space. I felt acutely aware of my posture, my breathing, every flicker of emotion that might reveal hesitation or uncertainty, and yet there was a strange comfort in the predictability, in the sense that the world around me was governed by precision and intent. Victor moved beside me with an ease that suggested complete familiarity, his eyes scanning each corner, noting every detail, and I sensed that his awareness extended to everything, not just people, but objects, light, and sound, each element contributing to the silent orchestration of his environment. He paused at a small sitting area, gesturing toward the chairs by the window, and I seated myself, my hands lightly resting on the armrests, feeling the subtle tension of anticipation in the space between us. The city lights flickered in the distance, softened by the slight mist lingering in the gardens, and I could see the reflection of that light in his eyes, a calm intensity that drew my attention while commanding silence and focus. Victor leaned slightly against the window frame, his gaze distant yet unbroken, and spoke in his measured, deliberate voice, "Emily, every choice you make now, every action, even in thought, shapes your path within this world. Awareness is the key, observation is the guide, and presence is the language of influence. His words resonated, embedding themselves within my consciousness as I processed the weight of the lesson unfolding before me, and I realized that this was less about instruction and more about immersion, about understanding the subtle dynamics of power and response in a world carefully structured yet endlessly fluid. I shifted slightly, my eyes following the faint movement of his hands, noting the way he adjusted the drapery and repositioned a small vase, the care and precision in these simple gestures speaking volumes about the expectations he set. The room was alive with quiet energy, a current flowing from his deliberate control to the space itself, and I felt myself gradually attuning to it, recognizing that observation, patience, and measured response were as crucial here as any overt guidance. I drew a slow, steady breath, absorbing the scent of polished wood and cool evening air, and became aware of the subtle pull between apprehension and curiosity, the tension of uncertainty balanced by the clarity of the environment and the intentionality of Victor's presence. In the quiet, I understood that my understanding of this world, and of him, would be built not on force, but on careful attention, adaptation, and recognition of the rhythms and signals around me, a lesson unfolding seamlessly within the architecture of his control, each moment a building block in the intricate pattern of influence, awareness, and connection that defined this night and the life into which I had been drawn. The night deepened, shadows stretching across the mansion with a quiet gravity that seemed to follow every step I took as I trailed Victor through the library, the rich scent of old leather and polished wood enveloping us. The dim light from the tall windows flickered gently on the spines of books arranged with exacting precision, and I felt the weight of his presence more keenly here, as though the room itself was attuned to him, each detail reflecting the order and authority he embodied. Victor moved toward a large, ornate chair near the center, gesturing for me to take the smaller one opposite, and I obeyed, aware that even a slight delay or misstep would register in his attentive gaze. The silence was not oppressive but charged, filled with unspoken lessons about observation, attention, and the quiet flow of power. I could feel the rhythm of the room, the subtle current of expectation, and I tried to anchor myself in the sensory details, the smooth texture of the wooden arms of the chair beneath my palms, the faint smell of polished floors, the whisper of the night wind brushing against the window panes. Victor finally spoke, his voice calm, deliberate, each word weighted with intention. "Emily, every environment, every interaction, carries signals. Your awareness shapes your path. Understand the context, respond with precision, and you will navigate this world safely." His eyes locked on mine, piercing yet not harsh, and I felt a strange clarity settle over me, a recognition that control was not about force, but about perception, understanding, and subtlety. I nodded, absorbing the gravity of his words, the sense that from this point onward, every glance, every gesture, every choice I made would ripple through the careful structure of his world. Outside, the faint rustle of leaves and distant city sounds reminded me of the space beyond these walls, yet inside, the mansion felt like a universe contained, governed by his meticulous presence. I shifted slightly in my seat, my heartbeat steadying as I mirrored the calm intensity of his attention, trying to attune myself to the flow of the room, the cadence of his movements, and the unspoken language that passed between observer and observed. The subtle click of his shoes as he paced, the soft sigh as he adjusted the curtains, the faint turn of his head toward the window to catch a reflection in the glass, all these details formed a tapestry of control, a lesson in reading environments, interpreting cues, and responding with awareness. I realized that the night had become more than a transition, it was an induction into the rhythms and expectations of a world I had only glimpsed, a world defined by deliberate action, attentive presence, and the quiet assertion of influence. And as I absorbed this, feeling both tension and comprehension intertwine, I understood that the lesson was ongoing, that each moment held instruction, and that the path before me was shaped not by sudden commands but by the steady, pervasive force of observation, perception, and careful engagement, a rhythm that Victor had established from the moment we had arrived and that would define every step I took from here onward. The night had fully settled, the sky a deep, velvety blue, and I stood near the tall windows of the mansion, the faint glow of distant city lights reflecting off the polished floors and casting long, delicate shadows that shifted as the wind whispered through the gardens outside. Victor moved beside me with the calm authority that had defined every moment of the evening, his gaze occasionally sweeping across the room, taking in details I had not noticed, the slight tilt of a picture frame, the alignment of books on the shelf, the subtle interplay of light and shadow on the furniture, and I felt the weight of his presence in every corner, in every quiet movement, a reminder that the world here was both structured and alive under his watchful eye. I took a slow breath, grounding myself in the ambient sounds, the faint ticking of a clock on the mantel, the soft creak of the floor beneath my feet, the gentle rustle of leaves against the glass, and tried to maintain the awareness that he demanded, focusing on each detail, each nuance, and the way my own actions and reactions fit into the rhythm of the space. Victor stopped near the center of the room and gestured toward the view beyond the windows, the expansive gardens bathed in the soft light of lanterns and the silver glow of the moon, and for a moment, the world outside seemed suspended, the distance between the estate and the city narrowing into insignificance compared to the immediacy of this space and the force of his attention. His voice broke the silence, calm, deliberate, yet resonant with an authority that commanded focus. Emily, you are learning that presence, attention, and understanding are as important as action itself. Every choice you make resonates here, shaping not only perception but the flow of events around you. I nodded slowly, feeling the clarity of his words settle, a recognition that mastery in this world came from observation and measured response, that the subtle shifts in posture, glance, and gesture carried as much weight as any overt directive. The mansion felt alive with quiet energy, a current of expectation that seemed to hum beneath the surface, and I realized that the training of attention, the cultivation of perception, and the ability to navigate with awareness were lessons I could not ignore. As I adjusted my stance, feeling the solid floor beneath my feet, the scent of polished wood and faint evening air mingling around me, I understood that the night had transformed into an extended moment of instruction, each second reinforcing the importance of mindfulness, the power of subtlety, and the weight of deliberate presence. Victor remained near the window, his silhouette framed against the moonlight, a calm anchor in the shifting nuances of the space, and I felt the resonance of his control, not as a threat, but as a structure I could learn to navigate, to understand, and ultimately to exist within. In that stillness, I sensed the quiet but inexorable shaping of my experience, the steady reinforcement that the rules here were observed not through coercion but through awareness, attentiveness, and the unspoken flow of influence that Victor wielded with seamless precision. And as the evening deepened, I realized that this night, this experience, had become a defining threshold, a point at which the world as I had known it was replaced with the rhythm, expectation, and subtle command of a presence that would guide every step forward.